Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kshama Sawant. My co-host Bia Lacombe will be back with us next week. Today we're going to be talking about the politics of sports. The connection between sports and politics may not be immediately apparent, but hundreds of millions of working people around the world love sports and spend part of their precious hours outside of work watching or playing sports. And in reality, there is a lot to discuss about the role of sports in society. But first, I want to talk about On Strike and the membership drive we have launched for Workers Strike Back. Become a member now and help ensure Workers Strike Back and continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement, and that On Strike can continue to bring you coverage of a wide range of issues that are very hard to find on mainstream media, like in today's show. On Strike doesn't run any ads. We don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people to support our work.
You're not alone, right? You're not just sitting on your couch, doom scrolling, reading all these different terrible news stories alone, that there are thousands and in reality millions of working class people who feel just as frustrated and also want to see a path forward, who know that higher wages, high quality healthcare, and high quality housing are totally possible.
We're building on the example of the past decade in Seattle on a national scale to widen and strengthen the class struggle. Who here wants to be a part of that movement?
Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Today, On Strike is delighted to have Suzanne Wrack, who is a British sports journalist and soccer writer at The Guardian. She is the author of A Woman's Game, The Rise, Fall, and Rise Again of Women's Football. Suzanne has often written and spoken about why she believes sports are important for working people and political activists. Taking the example of soccer or football as it's known outside the United States, Suzanne has talked about how the inequalities in wealth and power between the super rich and the mass of ordinary people that is omnipresent under global capitalism is starkly laid bare in the world of sports and soccer specifically. She has described how even though the game of soccer has unfortunately become a playground for oligarchs and the billionaire class, it still remains the sport of ordinary people, in part because of how accessible it is. Unlike other sports that require expensive equipment and facilities, all you need is a ball, which for the poor can be made of whatever it needs to be, whether socks, a mass of plastic bags or rags, or most anything else that can be constructed into something round. I spoke this past November in Liverpool in Britain at a rally organized by Socialist Alternative of England, Wales and Scotland, which is the sister organization of Socialist Alternative in the US. Suzanne spoke at the rally also, and I was struck by her words. She said, quote, "Where politics has isolated many, football retains their attentions. That makes football extraordinarily powerful. The voice of football, what football does and how it is run, matters because people follow it. It is also one of the few areas left, with rents sky high and populations so transient, where ordinary people can experience community, collective joy and pain, and feel united." End quote. With women's soccer, Suzanne has helped put a spotlight on the fight for equal and equitable pay and better working conditions, and the battles of women players against sexism, sexual abuse, and racism, battles that have helped embolden large numbers of women to understand the power of collective action and solidarity. It's really great to have you on the show, Suzanne. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
Great. To start with, why do you think the world of sports should be seen in the political context and shouldn't be dismissed by the left? And why you think sports is important for working people? What does it represent to them?
I mean, the thing is with sport is it's so like universally loved, right? Like there's so many sports that like enter into every area of society. Every household there is a fan of sport, of a sport. I mean, football in particular is, like you said in your intro, is at the forefront because it is so accessible in that it's so cheap to play. You don't need, kind of expensive equipment like you do for cricket or for or basketball where you need hoops, that kind of thing. You can just make a ball out of anything, chuck down anything for some goalposts, and you can play football. So it's hugely accessible and brings people together. It like inspires teamwork, collaboration. It's not about an individual. An individual can't be the hero of the hour. They can be a part of something special. They can be a key cog in the machine, but they are It's the purest example of collective action in a way, in that, there's no way you can win a game of football without collaboration and solidarity amongst teammates. And then it's obviously hugely followed. So it's got a extraordinary power because it's so influential. I mean, in many senses, you've got football teams, the Manchester Uniteds, Real Madrids, Barcelonas, Manchester Cities of the world sort of command more respect than governments do or political parties do. And that's an extraordinarily powerful position for it to be in, and yet it's used so poorly for any kind of good. And it's all about profit and commercialization, and just kind of building on this almost like an economic bubble, right, where it sort of needs to survive and thrive off ever increasing profits. So it's very similar to all other areas of society in that respect, but the huge power it wields in terms of just the sort of the love, the trust, the investment that people have in it, on an emotional level, and the way they connect with sport makes it a really, really powerful thing. When football or athletes say something, it resonates far greater than, say, if a politician says it. And that, I think in and of itself speaks for the power of sport.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I think one of the most the points that hit most home to me in what you just said is how the loyalty and respect that ordinary working people around the world feel for their sports teams and for the idea of sports itself is so much greater. Like, there's just vastly greater than any respect they feel for the political parties of big business, regardless of where you are, whether it's in Britain or the United States or any other country. And in fact, this, I think, has part to do with your book. So I was wondering if you could talk about your book, A Woman's Game, and why you felt this topic was so important to write about.
Yeah, so I actually had zero intention of writing a book. Wasn't that interested in it, but I was approached by a really nice agent who he's an amateur referee himself, so he's involved in football, and he thought that there would be a really good time to do a sort of general history of women's football ahead of the Women's Euros being held in England in 2021, which then got pushed back by COVID till 2022. And he sort of talked me into it, and I thought, that's actually quite a good idea. And the reason why he was able to sort of talk me into it is I sort of thought, I don't want anyone else to write this book, because I don't think they'll do it the way I think it should be done, which is politically and putting women's football in the context of society and all of the struggles of society and all of the struggles of women throughout history, because I feel like that's so crucial to the development of women's football, right? So when women's football is first taking off in England in sort of the late 1900s, it's in Victorian England, it's very frowned upon, it's being used as a tool of protest and struggle by women involved in the suffragettes and things, because they see it, they've noticed its power, they've noticed it can have a huge influence in society, and so they're recognizing that this could be a tool for us to advocate for suffrage, the right to vote, and all of these kind of things, the right for women to wear what they want, more broadly in society. So that's sort of like some of the very, very earliest involvement of women in football is from a political point of view more than necessarily a sporting point of view, although the women involved in that loved football as well and were into it and saw it in that sense. And then in the 1920s, when you've got women's football taking off again after it sort of died down, that's at a point in which in the war periods, where hundreds of thousands of men are being sent off to fight in the war, the factories are being filled with a female workforce, and they basically start to form women's football teams in the factories to keep morale up and stuff, in the same way that many of the men's football teams were formed in factories and workplaces. Morale boosting, fitness of your workforce, building camaraderie between your workers. That's what football was for. And women were doing that in the war whilst men were off fighting. There was no football being played because it had been paused for the war. Men were all off at war, so women took on that as well as stepping into the workforce. So that was another huge step forward. And then you had this massive setback after the war ended, and all the men come back and go back into the workplaces, and women are forced after this massively progressive step of feeling like they start to have some kind of control over their lives and their futures and their livelihoods and aren't so tied to, like, economically to men, suddenly are forced back into that role. And exactly the same thing happens in football. Suddenly you've got the FA talking about the unsuitability of football for women, and getting doctors and so-called experts to say that, if women play football, their uteruses will fall out while they're running, and things like, really mad things that just don't make any logical sense or any medical sense, but just so that they could sort of sideline women. And then also at that time, women had been raising money for injured soldiers during the war when they were playing, and after the war was over, they started raising money for their local communities. So they were raising money for the struggles that were close to them, striking miners. A lot of them were in mining towns, and other struggles like that. And so they were becoming political, and there was this money involved that was out of the control of the Football Association that they didn't like, because they didn't control women's football. So these women were raising money, huge sums of money, for striking miners and things, and it was becoming a political thing, and they didn't like that money existed and was going to places that weren't them. So there's all throughout history there's these sort of pockets of moments in time where the struggle of women to play football has been directly impacted and correlates to the struggle of women just generally in society and the just general workers' struggles. And so I thought it was really important that the book told it from that point of view, because I don't think that generally that sports is put into that position. Whereas, as we know, everything is interconnected, everything exists within the capitalist system, and is connected to it and has a relationship to it. And I wanted it to be told from that point of view so that you could start drawing parallels and people could take inspiration from other struggles and movements of women in other areas of society as well, and see those parallels and recognize that even just the act of playing football as a woman is a protest. Even if you have no political consciousness at all and feel completely removed from voting or the system or the political parties around you or even your community, the fact that you're playing football and defying social norms and what is expected of a woman is a political protest, even if you don't think of it that way, because you're pushing back against the rules of the system, and what is expected of you. And that to get people thinking like that. So that's why I sort of wanted to write it, to sort of have those discussions and tie those things together in a way that I wasn't necessarily convinced that many others would put forward that argument.
And that's exactly why On Strike is interviewing you, because I'm also positive, as you are, that in the hands of a non-political writer, or worse yet, somebody who's going to reinforce the standpoint that favors the logic of the capitalist system, would have done a terrible injustice to this fascinating and inspiring history, really, of women football players or soccer players fighting back, and revealing, and as your book does, revealing that football or soccer is not just soccer, not just a game that's happening on the field, but it ends up forcing these women players to turn it into a battleground against misogyny and for workers' rights. And I think for a lot of our American audience, even young people, it will harken back to, I'm sure if you're interested in sports, no matter how young you are, I'm sure you know about Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali, and how those sportsmen like them became inspiring figures who sort of got interwoven in the civil rights movement. And this is another example, the ongoing fight of women for their right to play soccer. And as you said, just kicking the football itself is an act of rebellion and protest. And specifically in that context, can you give us a sense of the battles women soccer or football players have had to carry out over wages and working conditions specifically, and how this fight back has spanned the entire world of women's soccer, all the way from United States to Africa?
Yeah, I mean, it's immense, really, and unsurprising, because if women having to struggle in all these different areas of society generally, why wouldn't those struggles exist within football? You're not going to have, I think many people think you're going to be able to build some kind of perfect world within women's football, and you're just not. It exists in the context of all the pressures of society. So
it exists in the context of capitalism overall.
Exactly, right? So you've got all those pressures of capitalism within women's football. So, in unequal pay, poor conditions, all of the things that women face in workplaces up and down countries all over the world to varying degrees, they experience within football. So, I mean, in the US, obviously, you had the huge equal pay dispute of the US women's national team, which was basically claimed. So their big lawsuit claimed it was institutionalized gender discrimination, and it was only settled in 2022 after a long battle, forced legal action, that kind of thing. And one of the big, issues was that the argument was, well, the men's team, make more money, so they deserve to be paid more than the women's team. And yet it had to reach a point where the women's team were earning more, which they were, before they started to push back on that argument. Never mind they're doing exactly the same job, in exactly the same conditions, but actually achieving more as well. But because the men were bringing in more, because their tournaments were valued more, it wasn't because, they were necessarily bringing more people through the doors in ticket sales and things like that. It was because, major tournaments. So the World Cup, for example, the men's World Cup, the prize money is so high compared to the women's prize money, which is hopefully going to be leveled out by 2027 and 2026. Those two World Cups, they should be the same prize fund. But for so long, because the men's team have taken, a significant portion out from just even qualifying for a World Cup compared to the women who could reach a final and win a World Cup and still take less money out of a World Cup. It's meant that they've been able to argue that, oh, well, they earn more, so they deserve a bigger slice of the pie, which is obviously a load of rubbish. Right. And I mean, that's proven at every level, and you've got it happening in countries all over the world. So Canada, they threatened strike action last year over discriminatory treatment. The federation's in big trouble there, lots of financial difficulty, but the conditions of the team are really poor. They suffer from unequal pay as well. In England, the England women's team have equal pay to a certain degree, but they were getting ready to strike over unfair bonuses ahead of the World Cup, and even threatened it. And that was a big step, because it was sort of the first time in England that the England women's national team players had gone public about their disputes with the federation. Previously, everything's been done behind closed doors, and they've negotiated and stuff. And they've sort of, for a very long time, and I think in a lot of countries, there's been a sort of gratitude complex where, oh, we've been given a few crumbs on the table, so we've got to be really happy about that. And, you see that in workplace struggles, right? If your boss gives you a little bit, you think, oh, yeah, great, let's not rock the boat further, let's not go for more, rather than thinking, yes, actually, no, we have a case here, we can push for much, much more. We have the power here. We have the power to withdraw our labour through not playing matches, and which upsets broadcasters, which upsets commercial deals. There's huge strength there. So they threatened that. They've now won that dispute. Are going to get much, much better bonuses and much better commercial deals from the English FA. But it's not just those countries. It's, Nigeria threatened to boycott their first match of the Women's World Cup over unpaid bonuses. There were reports after it took until after they were knocked out until we started to get sort of detail about what had been going on. But they didn't have enough hotel rooms, so you had players sharing beds, and not eating properly because they couldn't afford food, and flights, flying economy. And these are elite athletes that are, having to cross time zones to compete in this tournament, not being prepared properly to compete in it. The Republic of Ireland threatened strike action in 2017 over conditions, over having to change in public toilets, in like airports and things like that sometimes, having to share tracksuits with youth team squads. Australia, they called for equal prize money for the Women's World Cup during the World Cup itself. South Africa boycotted a pre-tournament friendly over unpaid bonuses. Zambia are still battling unpaid wages, and were battling that months before the World Cup, and erode a significant sum of money. Denmark boycotted a game against Sweden before 2019, and basically sacrificed their place in the World Cup, because that game being boycotted meant that the result was voided, and it meant that they went into a really, really difficult playoff game instead of topping the group, and essentially meant that they missed out on qualifying for the World Cup, whereas they likely would have qualified. So they sacrificed a huge amount. And then you've got individuals making sacrifices too. Ada Hegerberg of Norway basically went on strike from the national team for 5 years because she said, and she's one of the best players in the world. She's the Champions League top goal scorer in Europe. She has scored more than 250 career goals, hugely successful, was the first woman to win the Ballon d'Or.
Jouer le jeu et on s'est dit qu'on allait faire un truc un peu comme ça. Est-ce que tu sais twerker?
No. When she was on stage, having won that award, she was asked to twerk on stage, which was, hugely controversial, obviously. No, Messi wasn't asked to twerk when he got on stage collecting his award. But yeah, so she boycotted international football for 5 years and refused to play over a dispute with the Norwegian Federation over a lack of resources and investment in women's football in Norway. And that's a level of sacrifice that you just don't see many players sort of taking. And you definitely don't see many men's players taking as well. They don't generally sacrifice their sporting success and trophies and take that kind of action. So, I mean, there's been huge struggles, and they're pretty much constant. Like I say, Zambia is one that's ongoing, but there's a number of others. And there's still, even sort of in the aftermath of the World Cup, they FIFA had announced that they were ring fencing money, prize money for players as individuals from the World Cup prize money. But still a number of players haven't been paid that money, or they've been paid less of that money than they expected, and they're still having to fight for it, even though FIFA has mandated federations to pay them. I think it's around 30,000 Australian dollars for competing in the group stage, and then if they get further, it goes up and up. But a lot of players still haven't been paid that money, and that's money that's like game changing. That's more than a year's wages, sometimes more than 2 or 3 years' wages for some of the players from the least developed nations competing in the
and many of them are forced to have one and sometimes even two part-time jobs just to get by.
Exactly that. Yeah. You've got players who are competing in a World Cup, the biggest show in town, fighting. I think the Women's World Cup for the first time made a profit, but also was the second biggest sort of money-making sporting tournament in the world behind the Men's World Cup, beating all other sports. So it's a hugely significant tournament that generates a huge amount of money, even though it's obviously seconds to the men's. But then you've still got, like you say, players playing in evenings after the men have finished training because they've got to work in the daytime and work 2 or 3 jobs. You've got them training on artificial pitches instead of grass pitches, which is dangerous for their joints, joint health, big injury risks. You've got players, like you say, working numerous jobs, which impacts the amount of training they can do, impacts whether they can get to games, impacts whether they can have a family, short-term contracts that mean they are only signed up for a year, so they don't know if they're going to have to move in a year, so they can't lay down any routes or afford to buy homes or cars and things like that. And that's very different to the men's game, where a men's player changes teams and they just buy another house, right? Like they don't even have to sell the one they're in, and like they can just buy one and then move and then sell it if they want to, or they can keep it, or they've got resources, they've got money at their disposal that can pay for childcare and pay for childcare in the new team and new country that they're moving to, and all those kind of things. A woman has a team sell them, and it's particularly pertinent in the US, right, where the trading of players can happen without their knowledge and consent. So you get a player being traded from one city in the States to another city in the States without their permission or knowledge, and they're having to uproot everything and move it across the country with very little compensation for having to make that move. So they're having to think about selling their homes and buying new ones or renting ones, or like they may not have ever been able to afford to buy one. We're talking about wages that are so much smaller than what the men are paid to be able to accommodate that kind of lifestyle, and they're not given a fraction of that. So there's struggles all the time, there's like contradictions all the time, and yeah, there's it's ripe for sort of people to tie all of those struggles together and make the connections with all of all of the struggles of kind of not just women, but just working class people in general in wider society, because there's so many similarities and parallels between them.
Absolutely. And this is such an incredible chronicle of, I think, two features that really stand out. One is, as you've described so well, the incredible courage and sacrifice that women soccer players have undertaken. And these are teams from every possible country that has an international level soccer team. And then the other thing that stands out, of course, is how much the billionaire class, the super rich who own these football teams, who own FIFA, the International Football Federation or Soccer Federation, how they make all this money, both from men's and women's football and soccer, and so little of that is shared with the players, who are the actual stars, who actually make this game happen and engage billions of people around the world. And in your book, you talk about, I think, Megan Rapinoe, US star player, who called herself a walking protest, because many of these players understand that they can't really make this an actual sport, a viable sport, unless they keep fighting back for better conditions, better wages, more justice. And so in that context, talk about how the Matildas, the Australian national women's football team, how they recently won equal pay. What did it take for them to win? And obviously their fight is not over, but they've won a significant victory. How did they do that? And also talk about the importance for women soccer players to have a union.
Oh yeah, I mean, having a union is critical, and that's been a big controversial topic as well. Because I mean, particularly in England recently, because the Women's Super League players, the top tier of women's football in England, they are represented by the PFA, the Professional Football Association in England, that represents all professional men's players, but they don't represent the Women's Championship players, who are the Women's Championship is a part-time league. So there's some professional teams in there, there's some semi-professional teams in there, but they won't represent those players, and yet they're some of the players that need representation the most. They're the ones who are working jobs on the side, they're the ones who are battling the worst conditions of the teams that aren't quite as invested as teams at the top level. So union representation is key, and it's been a little bit of a battle to get union representation for the players, because in a lot of cases it's the professional men's teams and their leagues funding the union membership of professional men's players. So the Premier League in England pays money to the PFA to give support to players, basically, and that doesn't necessarily exist in women's football, and that kind of level of money doesn't exist. So there's less of the pot to go around. Never mind the fact that you could say that the huge amount of money that they're making on the men's game, some of that should possibly go to the women's game, which has been chronically underfunded for many years. There's a complete sort of contradiction there. But yeah, in terms of Australia, I mean, it's been brilliant in that they've sort of, through negotiations via the PFA, have managed to reach a sort of equal pay deal so that they're paid the same as the Socceroos, the men's team. But there's still a gap there as well, like you say, because in terms of the World Cup, like I say, I think saying it towards the start about the US women's national team, there's this massive gap between what men's teams receive for competing in major tournaments, or women's teams receive for competing in major tournaments, and that is still excluded. Prize money is still excluded from their pay deal.
736 footballers have the honour of representing their country on the world's biggest stage, this tournament.
Yet many are still denied the basic right to organise and collectively bargain.
Collective bargaining has allowed us to ensure we now get the same conditions as the Socceroos, with one exception. FIFA will still only offer women 1/4 as much prize money as men for the same achievement.
And our sisters in the A-League Women's are still pushing for football to be a full-time career, so that they don't have to work part-time jobs like we had to.
So still, you can have the Socceroos just about qualify for a major tournament and, probably not progress past the group stage, or reach the group stage and maybe get into the next round or not much further, and they will take home a huge amount more than the Matildas will have done for reaching a women's World Cup final, because the prize money coming from FIFA into those competitions is just so massively different. I think 2 World Cups ago, it was sort of the prize money for the women's was 30 million and the prize money for the men's was sort of, close to 400 million. So we're talking about, more than 10 times the amount that the men get. And then for the 2019 World Cup, the women's was increased to 60 million, but the men's was still increasing as well. So the gap isn't actually really closing, and it's only by the men's 2026 World Cup and the women's 2027 World Cup that we're going to see equalised prize money. But then, I mean, there's still such a huge gap between them that you think, well, shouldn't it go the other way, if anything, and more money be invested into the women's, given that it's been so let down for such a long time. But yeah, so that's a big problem, because the unequal prize money has meant that federations have been able to argue that they can sort of, yes, we're paying them equally from what we pay as a federation, but in terms of prize money, we can't pay that equally. And that was a big victory actually of the US women's national team, because one of the things they got in their pay deal was prize money included. So the prize money for the men's and women's teams that they win for competing in major tournaments is pooled together, and that is distributed fairly amongst them. And that's not what the Matildas have got yet, which I think is something that they really need to push for. But what happens generally is that one team kind of gets a big result, and then the next one follows, and the next one pushes a little bit higher and gets a little bit more, and then it has a knock-on effect. And so that's, for me, one of the exciting things about what women's football can teach and what sport can teach people about struggle, is that you don't have to just settle. There is more, and you can actually win. And we have so few victories nowadays, given how on the offensive capitalism is generally, that these small wins can actually be quite impactful and show people that actually struggle does win in a world where so often we're told that it doesn't. So they deserve a decent slice of the pie. At the same time, we also got to say that the extraordinary money rolling around in the men's game is not necessarily like do we want Megan Rapinoe to be earning the money that Lionel Messi is? No, I mean, that's obscene. No one should be earning that. Do we want women players to be able to earn a living that is going to sustain them? Yes. Do we want them to be able to have a home and to not worry about their future after football? Do we want them to be prepared for their future after football?
And can they have a decent standard of living with just one job?
Exactly that. Yeah. Can they just work the one job? Can they support a family? Can they cover their transport costs, their food, their equipment, all of those things? Yes, we want them to be able to live a sustainable life in the way that we would like everyone to. But then also, a lot of the wealth and money in football isn't going on player salaries and player transfers, but is instead going back into, schools and sports programs at grassroots level, or even into other areas of society. Why not into, healthcare systems on issues that impact players, head injuries, and all those kind of things that have, proved to be hugely impacted by playing sport. There could be huge amount of money invested in things like that would benefit society generally. Yes, we want, equal pay and all of these kind of things, but we also want it to be just a different world generally too.
Yes, exactly. And talking about building that different world, we couldn't do that. And I'm sure you'll agree, Suzanne, and you've already spoken about this. It's not only that we don't, as you were correctly saying, it's not like we want a few star players to get obscenely high salaries. It's also a question of the obscene profits that the owners of these football teams and the Football Federation are making. And as you've written in your book, the oligarchs who are profiting from this sport, while not only the women's soccer players, but the vast majority of society is languishing with most of its needs grossly unmet or undermet. And I totally agree. The ideas that you put forward about all of this wealth actually flowing to the needs of society as a whole. And I think as you were describing the story of the US women's soccer team and the Matildas and so on, all of this charts the same course of the fight against misogyny, gender pay gap, and also how unions are imperative. And even after winning a union, the fight is far from over. Winning a fair contract is a long and hard fight, as the women soccer players are experiencing. And this is true whether you're a soccer player or a warehouse worker at Amazon or a public sector worker or a healthcare worker. And in fact, the power of solidarity that you've highlighted and everything you've said and also in your book is really inspiring. And I just wanted to mention to our viewers also that about how this is really playing out in real time in this the fact that women soccer players are understanding that they need to have solidarity. You mentioned this before, Suzanne, but how the Matildas released a collective statement on the eve of the Women's World Cup tournament last year, 2023, calling out the gender pay gap presided over by FIFA. And I was particularly impressed by the fact that all 23 team members spoke up in this video, and they talked about the importance of having a union, the ability to fight for a collective bargaining agreement, and saying that they wanted to have a voice in something bigger than football. And most crucially, they also stood up for rival teams in other nations who are still, as they said, are still denied the basic right of having a union, which you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's key, right? Like, and what's really satisfying working in women's football and with some of these players is that they're all incredibly intelligent, because they've all had to be. Like, they've all from a very early age, players in men's football are groomed for elite football, right? Like, they are put into environments that cultivate them as football players, but not necessarily as people that are going to be valuable members of society, that are thinking, that are educated. You know, they have their educations paid for, but it's, you know, very streamlined and things. And, you know, sort of a sidekick to their footballing education. Whereas these women players, they've had to study. Like, on the side, they've had to, you know, get degrees. They, you know, some of them still study. Erin Cuthbert, Chelsea, has just finished a law degree. Leah Williamson, England captain, is a qualified accountant. Like, these are people that have gone off and, you know, skilled themselves to a high level. Lucy Bronze, when she started, was working in Domino's Pizza while she was playing and studying, playing football, studying, and working in Domino's Pizza. Like, they are very grounded, and it's like quite nice because it means they have a connection to like communities and ordinary people and society in a way that, you know, men's football have sort of been removed from it. So that's really great. But yeah, so they have this level of intelligence. They are very, very committed to solidarity and working together, and they've had that through football, because every single thing that they've done to be able to play has been won, right? I think that, you know, what's kind of sad is that the unions that represent footballers aren't, I don't think they see themselves as like labour unions in the traditional sense, even though they technically are. You know, obviously they get funding from the governing bodies to help them run and things like that. But you know, at heart they are representing players, and I think that, like, in many respects, they badly need good representation. But I don't think they're necessarily quite aware of how important that is. But it's getting there, and like I said a couple of times already, but this gratitude complex has started to shift aside, and that's been a huge barrier to people speaking out. And once that's gone, you're starting to get these powerful collective voices come together and raise concerns over things like equal pay, and you know, threaten action for you know, a lack of resource or whatever it may be.
Right. And another area which has seen women's soccer players and also in other sports organizing is in relation to sexual abuse and harassment. To start with, can you talk about the Jenny Hermoso case, where Hermoso, a Spanish woman football player, was outrageously subjected to a publicly seen non-consensual kiss on the mouth by Luis Rubiales, the president of the Spanish Football Federation? Tell us how this is a microcosm of sexism in sports.
Yeah, I mean, just the very fact that, you know, that could happen in the public eye, like, immediately raises alarm bells. Or, you know, what does he think is acceptable behind the scenes, right?
Absolutely,
what is
it just makes me so angry just thinking about it.
Exactly. I mean, you literally, you know, you see him on the biggest stage. There's close to 1 billion people watching worldwide on various broadcasts and streams and things. And he holds her face and kisses her square on the lips. And, you know, it's obviously wrong, right? Like, he has, you know, repeatedly claimed in all of his statements, in his appeals to his 3-year ban from FIFA, that it was consensual. And she says it wasn't, but also, even if it was, so what, right? Like, this is a man in a position of power, the president of her federation, kissing her on the lips,
Yeah,
whether it's
and I don't
consensual
think
or
it
not, it
can
doesn't
actually,
matter,
yeah,
right?
and I don't think it can actually be, I mean, in that sense, consensual, in the sense that he has so much power over her, and for that to happen publicly like that, it's just, she has very little say in the matter.
Exactly. And what is consent in that instance, right? Like,
Right.
it's, what she says no, but he's her boss on the biggest stage in front of the watching world. Like, he didn't even really give her a chance. He just sort of grabbed her face and pulled her in. I mean, it's just horrific. But, you say, how is it a microcosm of society generally, is that, this is so endemic in sport, and there's so many issues with sport and sexual abuse and assault and, comments and things. There's been so many issues in countries across the world, from the States to England to then, more developing countries as well, where the power imbalances that football sort of enables makes it really, really ripe for predators, because it's also very, very easy to get qualified as an amateur coach. It's very, very easy to do your badges. You have to have, like, criminal record checks and things like that, but you renew those once a year, and it's all quite easy to be put in a position of power without much regulation or checking on what is going on at grassroots level. So you've got a sort of a world that is very, very ripe, and it's not just football. I've been dealing with some sexual abuse in sports cases in gymnastics, one in skiing as well. The when you're putting, as a player, all of your ambition in the hands of a coach or a couple of coaches who decide your future in that sport, to determine whether you're going to compete at tournaments, whether you're going to be in teams, whether you're going to get the opportunity to go and compete in elite camps and have extra training, which of the coaches is going to be in charge of your future, like all of those little things, like, embed this level of power into this dynamic that is really unhealthy, and then there's nothing following it up. There's nothing that sort of checks in on that. There's no regulation at all. So it's like really, really not just a microcosm of it. It almost is like an exaggeration of it as well, because of that. So all of the things that happen in society generally, all of the experiences that women have of abuse, of assault, they all exist within football, right? Nothing is removed from what's going on in society. And if anything, within sport, you've got this, again, a sort of
It's even
hotbed
more
of
pronounced,
it, because because it is so easy to get in and command a level of control, and the power structures within football are so dominated by a group of people, at sort of every level in every country. It's like fiefdoms, and who not what and it's such a lucrative industry to be in that then getting disciplined is very difficult, because it's your friend that you've put into a position of power here, it's a friend that you've put into a position of power there, and if they're undermined, that undermines you. You've got their vote, you need their vote.
Right.
Oh, they've got an accusation against them, no, I need their vote, let's protect them. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. So it's really distasteful in like so many ways. And then, I mean, you've got the fact that, in the case of Jenny Hermoso, it wasn't a one-off incident, right? Like, this was, yes, in and of itself, in that evening, it wasn't a one-off incident, in that he also lifted another player over his shoulders and kissed another one on the cheek. And then it's come out in the report, FIFA have just released the findings of how they came to the decision to ban him for 3 years from football, and they say that he also kissed one of the England players and stroked her on the cheek and hugged Lucy Bronze inappropriately, and things like that. So there's a number of things he did that night that were really like questionable, but then it's not new in Spain, because the Spanish women's national team have been protesting since like 2011, I think, is one of the earliest examples, but way before that as well, about the federation's indifference to women's football. And they finished bottom of their group at the Canada World Cup, and they called for the resignation of their manager and for better training and facilities. He was sacked, but the senior players that had sort of led that rebellion were basically phased out of the squad. So there was a big retaliation piece as well. And then the new manager, Jorge Vilda, was just another ally of the president. And they've had big complaints about him for a number of years. So after the Euros in 2022, 15 players wrote a letter to the federation saying they were going to withdraw from being called up because they felt their health and safety was being impacted by the environment around the national team. And the president of the federation, Rubiales, who's been banned, he backed the manager and the players weren't called up. And so you got some of the best players in the world not competing in international matches for Spain for a good 6+ months without much sort of furore, without much controversy. People talked about it, but nothing was done. They just got away with it because they could, because that is the extent of the power of the leaders of football in various countries. And even when, Rubiales is seen on TV kissing her on the lips, sexually assaulting her, that is what it is, live on telly, it's a good number of weeks before he's forced to resign. And even then he's clinging on to power because he can, because there's no check, right?
His response is, completely devoid of shame.
Para que pidan mi dimisión.
Is that so serious that I have to leave while having done the best job for Spanish football?
Yesterday, Mr. Rubiales had been expected to stand down, but instead came defiance.
I will not resign.
No, voy a dimitir.
I will not resign.
He said 5 times, I will not resign.
And in fact, before this action, before FIFA was and the Spanish Football Federation was forced to take this action against Rubiales because of the outrage against him and over 80 players saying they're not going to play until he has faced consequences. Before that, they actually tried to punish Hermoso for her courage in speaking up and saying she's going to face consequences, she's lying, and that there's going to be some kind of retribution against her. They attempted that. It's just that they didn't get away with it. And in fact, along these lines, can you also, obviously this is just such a systematic issue, the issue of sexual harassment, abuse, and even rape. And in fact, you mentioned gymnastics. Obviously, most people who are watching this will know what's now come to be the biggest sexual abuse and harassment scandal in world sports history, which happened for 2 decades in the U.S. gymnastics team, where 500 women athletes, and many of them were minors when this happened, have said that there was systematic abuse going on. Can you tell us what happened with the Afghanistan women's soccer team and what happened there and how you helped bring that to light?
Yeah, so it came to me in sort of late 2018, where I had previously interviewed she was the captain of the Afghanistan women's national team, just about the Afghanistan women's national team. This was about 8 months before this sort of came to light. About what it was like to, and what women's football was like in Afghanistan. And we done in it, and we kept a relationship. And then she sort of tweeted months later about having been kicked off the team. A number of the players had, because they refused to sign contracts that were going to basically sign away their rights to sponsorship, that they couldn't have social media without the federation's say so, all of these different kind of, really oppressive things that were designed to drive them out of the team. Many of those women competing outside of Afghanistan, living in the USA or Germany or Denmark, but competing for the Afghanistan women's national team. And they, obviously were extremely frustrated. And I reached out to Shabnan, who I'd been in touch with previously and interviewed previously. I said, "What's going on here? I want to write about this. What's happening?" And she sort of spoke to me about it for a while, and the difficult sort of kind of rock and hard place situation they've been put into. And then she kind of kept saying I needed to speak to their coach. And I just got the impression there was something else going on there that she didn't really know how to say in the right way. And so she connected me with the head coach, Kenny Lindsay, who is a former US player. She made a couple of starts for the US women's national team, and then injury sort of ended her career quite early. But really, really talented coach. she had been working with them for a number of years, and I spoke to her, and she basically said that a load of the players had been being sexually abused by the president and a number of other people involved in women's football in Afghanistan. They had found out on a training camp in Jordan that was the case, when two of the coaches that had been sent with them sort of took advantage of their position of traveling with the players to take part in the camp. And a number of players have made them aware of the advances of the president, and really sort of serious sexual abuse. We're talking, quite extreme examples of rape, of death threats, and of people disappearing as well, of players just disappearing and never being seen again. And so she told me all this information, and I was like, this is awful and needs exposing, but without any evidence, it's really hard to legally publish it. So she connected me with Khalida Popal, who was one of the founders of the team and a former captain, and had been coordinating the team from exile in Denmark, where she had been living for a number of years. And she had been working for close to a year gathering evidence and information and witness statements from girls, and trying to get the ones who are most at risk out of the country, because the president of the Afghanistan Football Federation at the time, Karamadam Karim, was a really dangerous guy, ex-warlord, military man, big connections. And she'd done a lot of work with the coach Kelly Lindsay, with a number of other people, to help get some of the most vulnerable women out of the country at that time who had been sexually abused by the president, to enable them to be able to give evidence in a case to FIFA on it. But the problem is that FIFA were sort of dragging their heels and were being really, really slow to actually open the case against him formally. They were doing a lot of it behind the scenes, quietly, because he was a vote in the system, so they had to be quite careful about who they let know, so they didn't get back to him. So then they came to me asking for help and to publish the story, and basically with the intention of making sure that FIFA would sort of be forced to take it seriously. So we published a story about the sexual abuse of the president, and then it exploded things. Then literally within days, FIFA had formally opened their case against the president and suspended him, as well as 5 other people. Then the Attorney General in Afghanistan also launched an investigation. The government spoke on it. It was all over the news. So it sort of massively accelerated the pace of it being taken seriously, which was really important. A lot of the comeback from the federation and the president was that this was former players outside of the country, just angry at having been dropped from the team, and they were just axe to grind, that kind of thing. And so that was when we published a massive interview with 5 players who were in Afghanistan and had been sexually abused by the president of the federation, showing, talking about the extent of the abuse they had suffered, that really then swung the narrative back on what he had done, and not on kind of any axe grinding players that had just done their bit in trying to expose it. So it was huge. I mean, he got banned for life from football by FIFA, and a number of others were being investigated, and there was a warrant for his arrest in Afghanistan, which he managed to avoid. And then a few years later, the Taliban take over, and the ballpark changes completely, and none of it is in the news anymore. He's never been arrested, and a lot of the women that were involved, now they none of them are involved in football anymore because they can't be. A number have got out of the country, but yeah, I mean, it was sort of football's first Me Too, big Me Too sort of movement story, and was the tipping point for others to start coming forward. So there was a big case in Haiti of the players being abused by the president of that federation. There have been cases in Gabon with male players being abused. We did an article a number of years ago that was about all of the different sexual abuse cases in football that we had come across as The Guardian, and we published a list of 12 countries, but we actually had a list that was much longer than that. but we couldn't like legally publish a lot of them because they were, it was just not enough evidence, or some of them, we, kind of knew to a certain degree and had reports of it, but it wasn't quite enough to be published. So it's absolutely endemic, and Afghanistan was sort of the tip of the iceberg, making a lot of people start to bring these cases to light. And then we had the cases in the US around some of the coaches in the NWSL as well, issues in Canada too. So yeah, it really was a little bit of a tipping point for a lot of these stories coming to light and exposing just how endemic it is within football. And that in turn show, again, points back to wider society, because, if we want to get rid of sexual abuse and inequality from football, you've got to do it from wider society, because if it exists in one, it exists in the other. So it then challenges a lot of people to think a little bit more about society, as well as just, these things happening within this little bubble of football.
Right. This is just really both absolutely riveting, this story and everything you've shared with us today, Suzanne, and also extremely important from a standpoint of political analysis, as you're explaining that there's no island of utopia that can be created under capitalism. It doesn't matter whether you're in a barista at Starbucks, or you're an Amazon worker, or a healthcare worker, or you're a soccer player. We're going to face the same problems that are endemic to a deeply unjust and unequal system like capitalism. And I think one of the most important lessons that comes from everything you've shared with us today is, as you said, the rejection of the gratitude complex and taking up a militant approach to fight back. And I think that's most valuable, and I think that will be familiar to many of the viewers of On Strike. So I really wanted to thank you, Suzanne, for being so generous with your time today, and hopefully we can catch up with you again.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to come on anytime. Like I say, there's always another little avenue of struggle within sport and women's football at the moment. So I'm sure there'll be many more opportunities for us to chat again. But yeah, it's very enjoyable to be able to show people that sport isn't just about chucking a ball, kicking a ball, and can be there's a little bit more to it than that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and we'll see you soon. On Strike is a production of Workers Strike Back, a nationwide organization fighting on working class demands like a $25 an hour minimum wage, union jobs, Medicare for all, and against discrimination and oppression. Workers Strike Back is also calling for a new party for working people, because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party represents us. On Strike is a broadcast entirely for working people, funded entirely by working people. Solidarity.